The views, information, or opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, our funders, or any of the organizations affiliated with this project. Welcome to a Seeds of Wellbeing Experts in the Field podcast, featuring people working in their fields of expertise to provide support for agriculture producers in Hawaii, in the United States, and in some cases around the world. These podcasts are made possible by a grant from the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, also known as CTAHR, and the Seeds of Wellbeing or SOW project, and is supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the Hawaii Department of Agriculture.
Along Kaʻeo Duarte, I'm the Vice President of Community and Aina Resiliency for Kamehameha Schools, the team that, in a nutshell, oversees all of our non-commercial lands and real estate resources on 5 islands.
Thank you. And Marissa?
Sure. Aloha, my name is Marissa Harman. I'm the Director of Asset Management in Community and Aina Resiliency, overseeing all the agriculture and conservation lands statewide.
In this episode, we speak with Kaʻeo Duarte and Marissa Harman from Kamehameha Schools and Bishop Estates. They talk about the 135-year history of KS and its strategic vision, but we focus on how they manage the approximately 88,000 acres deemed to be high-value ag land that's in their portfolio. We also share how an ag producer can apply for KS land leases and talk about all those eucalyptus trees planted on KS land along the Hamakua Coast on the Big Island. So let's hear more from Marissa and Kaʻeo. Perhaps for folks that aren't familiar with the history or might want to hear it from you folks directly, would you mind sharing a little bit about the history of Kamehameha Schools, Bishop Estates, what the connection is, those pieces, just as an initial background?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So, as you mentioned, most people in Hawaii are familiar with Kamehameha Schools, but for those who aren't, we were established by Princess Pauahi, the last descendant of the Kamehameha line. She had no children or heirs herself, and I guess during her lifetime, she really saw the decimation of the Native Hawaiian population with the introduction of Western disease, and it declined about 65%, the Native Hawaiian population during her lifetime. And so she really saw education as the key tool to the future of Native Hawaiians thriving and continuing on. So she passed in 1884, and via her will, the schools were established in 1887. So this year we're celebrating our 135th anniversary. And so, with I guess the loss of life amongst a lot of the ali'i at the time, who really also lost some of their heirs to disease, a lot of the lands were passed to Pauahi from her various chiefly family members. And so at the time of her death, her estate was about 375,000 acres. And she really directed that her property would be used to fund her educational mission. And so in carrying out her will, the leasing of our lands is one way that we continue to fund that educational mission. And today, our current strategic vision for the year 2040, it's a 15-year strategic plan, strategic vision it's a 25-year. We did this in 2015, is to see a thriving lahui where our learners and, Pauahi students that she envisioned all those years ago are having success in life, in community, and have good choices ahead of them. So that's really our focus right now is a thriving lahui.
That's great. Thank you. And now, just for clarification, Bishop Estates, how does that tie into Kamehameha Schools, and what's the delineation of that? Would you mind sharing?
Yeah, I think for much of the early years, the Bishop Estate was sort of the trust or the endowment, and then Kamehameha Schools was the physical school. Which I went with for a lot of the history, was one school on the hill in Kapalama, and we're sort of the business end of the organization and the school end of the organization. But in late 90s into the 2000s, we made an important pivot, both in form and function, that we really need to be a united organization, and that our lands and the resources that the trust and the endowment has are part and parcel to our larger mission for well-being of our Native Hawaiian people, and tying to our education mission. So the trustees made an important decision that we really need to be one organization, and so part of that was moving towards one name, one organization in like the 2000s. So at this point, it really is Kamehameha Schools.
Okay, that's great.
So yeah, but I realize that's a journey. I think in some communities and so forth, the kind of the monikers are still Bishop Estate, Kamehameha Schools, but over time we think that we'll work through that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, because you hear both names, both terms, and so that's helpful to help cut to the chase, right, of the relationships. And now we know we can just say Kamehameha Schools, yeah.
Yes.
And is it disrespectful to call it KS, or or is that for the sake of our conversation? Is that, I don't want to disrespect it all, but I feel like it is a little bit to call it KS, but you tell me.
I think it's okay. I think it's worth to say CAM Schools. I think CAM Schools is has more sensitivity than saying KS. So yeah, I think we're okay with KS as a abbreviation for Kamehameha Schools today.
Great, yes. So I think, I mean, as I understand it, I don't know if this is still the case, but I think at a certain point, was Kamehameha and Bishop Estates, was that one of the largest, wealthiest trusts in the country? Is that true?
So you mean from a dollar standpoint?
Yeah, I think probably from assets and value of the estate. I believe I heard at one point, and maybe again, maybe it's not true.
Checked recently. There is a list online of the largest philanthropic trusts in the nation or in the on the globe, and I think like a decade or so ago, KS was one of the top 10. So Kamehameha Schools was one of the top 10 philanthropic trusts in the nation, if not the world. I believe since then, with billionaires and multi-billionaires becoming much more common, I don't believe we are in the top 10 anymore, that there are a lot larger trusts now. But we are among that group, I guess, of philanthropic educational trusts, and definitely one of the largest native or indigenous, and definitely one of the oldest on the list for sure. Many of the larger trusts are much younger, so we're probably one of the oldest and only indigenous trusts of kind of this size from a dollar standpoint.
I would imagine a lot of that is just land assets, and the value of land has increased so dramatically, is where that value comes from. But
not really, actually. I mean, that is a part of it. So for much of our history, we were land rich and cash poor. So probably for a good 2/3 or 3/4 of our 135-year history now, we were land rich, cash poor, and we even sold land. So the lands were bigger, and there are actually times where we sold lands literally to make payroll for our teachers on campuses. But over time, kind of starting in the 70s and 80s and so forth, as through some transactions of our residential lands on Oahu and so forth, and some smart investments by leadership, we have over time become more well endowed, tied to our financial investments. So for much of the history, yes, the real estate was the primary, and the activities on our real estate lands was the primary source of funds. But as it stands today, please don't quote me on the exact numbers, but actually our Hawaii real estate is maybe 1/3 of the value of KS's endowment, while our financial investments team, who invest nationally and globally, are probably 2/3. So it has swung from a time when the real estate was the majority of the value of the endowment, to now that our investments nationally and globally are a larger portion of our endowment, and our real estate is about 1/3 of the value.
Interesting. Thank you.
I think one important point before we dive into Ag 2 is just to paint a context, right? I think for us as a whole team managing Aina Pauahi, which is something what we refer to our Hawaii real estate portfolio as Hawaii's Aina, as an Aina Pauahi team of both the team that Marissa and I are on that manage the ag land. We also have our colleagues out on our commercial side who manages all of our commercial real estate. It's a much smaller acreage, but extremely high value real estate. That's important to realize that, you know, for us, we're aspiring to, as a long-term institution, manage a really manage Hawaii lands as a diverse portfolio of diverse kinds of assets and resources and value streams, both financial value and other non-financial values for Hawaii and our community. So agriculture is a piece of that, but within our commercial side, residential, recreation, resort, retail, industrial. So there's many different subcomponents of our real estate, forestry and timber, renewable energy, natural and cultural resources, water resources, indigenous knowledge spaces for learning and Aina-based education. So when we think of our Aina Pauahi portfolio, we really are trying to look, as you zoom out, at a large, diverse portfolio, and how do we position it to, yes, you know, create a good portfolio returns financially, but also to have, you know, good positive impacts on jobs, careers, and a variety of industries that are important for both Native Hawaiians and Hawaii, and agriculture as a subset of this larger portfolio, which I believe is what the topic of today's conversation is. But just important to know that it sits within a much larger portfolio and set of strategies.
You know, absolutely. Lots of audiences to try to give attention to and make sure are heard, it sounds like. And so of the land assets that are managed in your portfolio, do you have a sense of what percentage are ag, for example, versus the other types of land management that you do?
So in terms of acreage, we're roughly at about close to 50% in conservation of our acreage, 48-ish% around agriculture, and then the remaining 2% is in that urban, rural, kind of other classification. So the majority of our lands are in the agriculture and conservation portfolio.
How was it decided that those would be agriculture and set aside for agriculture versus conservation, for example?
Sure, and actually I should have prefaced that's based on state land use classification. So the state land use districts of conservation, ag, rural, and urban. So that's how we're categorizing them. It's not necessarily a classification that Kamehameha has placed on those lands. So of our ag portfolio, if we're looking roughly at that, 48-50% mark, right? We're around 175,000 acres. To Kaʻeo's point, maybe about 12, 13 years ago, we looked at what acreage is actually high value agricultural land. Because as we know, when the state land use classifications were done, somewhat broad strokes in some areas. And so initially we looked at maybe 88,000 of those acres were high value agriculture. But the reality is today we lease out under lease with farmers and ranchers. We have almost 78,000 of those acres under lease with about 900 farmers and ranchers statewide. So the amount of our highly usable ag land is pretty close to being in use and under contract for the most part.
Yeah. And how was that decided that it was high value?
That's some of an exercise we did internally, looking at soil types, looking at rainfall, looking at availability of infrastructure. I mean, many of our lands also, have less infrastructure than folks would think, right? So some of those ag lands that are not in use, roughly that 10,000 acres or so, accessibility is not as good as some other locations, may only be rain fed. Those are some of the conditions that prevent us from leasing out some of those other lands as we get to a point of being able to really focus on what's vacant and how we can continue to get those lands stewarded by farmers and ranchers.
I think that is an important and valuable distinction, though, because there are state maps you can go to that you can drill down and they tell you what the land's type of soil is, and and some of those types of things can be found online. But I think it sounds like you folks have gone the extra step and really gone on site and looked at the properties and know what's available and access and rainfall and those types of things. You really did all the work to, as if an ag producer were to go there and determine if it was going to be usable and functional for their needs. So that seems like it's a tremendous value.
Yeah, and maybe to add to Marissa, to your, I think also included in your question was from the larger portfolio of state ag zone land, how did we get down to the 88,000? I kind of mentioned it, but just to be kind of a little bit more crystal clear, in areas, especially here in Kona where I'm sitting in Maoka Kona, they zoned a lot of land up on the mountains when the ranches were very extensive, all the way up into the areas where there's a lot of native forests. And we made the decision that there are some lands zoned agriculture that as a Native Hawaiian institution, we don't think agriculture is the right use for those lands up in the really far Mauka region. So we made the decision we manage those lands more for stewardship of native species and cultural and natural landscapes. So that's where we kind of went from the state zoning classification. We took out lands that we want to steward for sensitive species, native species, cultural landscapes. And then we got down to the 88,000, and that's the land we're focused on to put into production for a diverse set of agricultural uses. Does that help?
And to add a little bit to that, Kaʻeo, those lands like in the Mokokona area still contribute to agriculture, even though we're stewarding them for natural resources and the contribution they make to our watershed. So still part of the bigger picture for sure.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's helpful. And it's certainly much more complex than I originally thought as I hear you describe it. So it's also helpful to understand the complexity of what you do and how you do it. I think one of the things I mentioned before is we've spoken to many ag producers and they're interested in Kamehameha lands. And I mean, if with all respect, I'll say that some folks have said that, as we just kind of led up to this, Kamehameha has all the money, they have all the land. Why aren't they helping ag producers more by giving inexpensive plots of land to as many ag producers as need to? So, I mean, again, things are complex, and that's one of, if we've learned nothing else, not only from this conversation but from the Seeds of Wellbeing project, is there are no simple answers. So I just thought I'd put that out there, just again with respect, to just get a sense of your response to that.
Yeah, I'll start and let Marissa fill in, especially since Marissa is closer to the details, the numbers than I am. I'll let her, but maybe I'll start at a high level. Well, no, I think that's a great question, a valid question. I can tell you that our team thinks hard about that question of how do we make agriculture a viable, not just a viable, but a thriving industry, both so our lands are productive and, as Hawaiians, you say momona, or fat and productive lands. Yes, financially, but again, non-financially. And for part, we believe it also ties to our mission as an organization, well-being of Native Hawaiian children. We're going to be inherently tied to well-being of the lands and the communities they live. So I think it's a great question, and it's something that we challenge ourselves with day in and day out, of how do we do our best on our watch. Maybe I'll start at a high level and I'll try and get through this quickly, that, as you really look through the history of Kamehameha School's lands, but all lands in Hawaii, I think there's some big overarching themes that both us, the state, and other land, small, medium, and large, are wrestling with and dealing with to make agriculture a thriving industry in Hawaii. It's, pre-plantation, there are traditional ag systems, which in many cases, interestingly, were exactly in the opposite places, where, our kupuna were in the valleys, the stream valleys along waterways and so forth. And when the plantations came, in places, the agriculture moved to plateaus and places away from our water bodies, and they took water to them. And so massive changes in just the landscape of agriculture. And as you know, that went on for a good 75 in some places close to 100 years. And Kamehameha schools, like many others, were a part of that period where, on one hand, it's ironic to think about it, but at that time, sugar, pineapple, agriculture was the dominant industry in Hawaii. It was to Hawaii what tourism is to Hawaii today. Agriculture was big business for a big period of territorial and statehood and so forth. But you could also say that, was it feeding Hawaii? So there's a paradox in when agriculture was the biggest industry in Hawaii, but it didn't necessarily look the way we want it to look. And I think as the plantation started to go bankrupt, 70s, 80s into the 90s, and lands for us, as land started to come back to Kamehameha schools, which was primarily, somewhat of a passive lessor of those lands for many periods. We've been on a journey, which again, I would argue that many others are also on the same journey, of transitioning tens of thousands of acres that were under plantation into something else. And I would say we're still on that journey as a state. We are still in transition from, in many places, from plantation to a future agricultural vision, which is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. It's also exciting that we're at this pivot point. It's a long pivot point because it takes time. There are, at least for us, I can speak for KS, so many water issues, environmental cleanup issues, legal and boundary issues, community issues. When the plantation pulled out, they left a lot of things that had to be dealt with before we're even ready to do agriculture, even ready to move forward with new things. So that's been a journey. That's been a big part of the team's work, both our team and those before us. Places where plantations didn't work early on, like Kona, where sugar just didn't quite work here. Kamehameha schools, it's interesting, you read in our archives, we were with the UH, we were doing research on alternative crops. Like, how do we make these? They were asking questions similar to us, but a different time of, okay, what do we do with these lands? How do we make them productive? How do we make them economically and so forth? And they sent delegations to research coffee and cacao and all of these topics in the 60s and 70s, which led to the Kona coffee belt in Kona. So that's an example of a previous generation of Kamehameha schools land managers who are trying to figure out how to make these lands productive. But fast forward again to the 80s and 90s, it was not very long ago. So many of our lands, we have been working on roads and infrastructure. We spent millions of dollars on roads, water systems, fencing, boundary issues, and so forth, since the early 2000s to now, to get lands ready to be deployed for new kinds of agriculture. So that has been a lot of our work the last 20 years. And while there's more work to be done, we don't have it all figured out. We are proud that then, as Marissa mentioned earlier, our occupancy rate is steadily going up, that we are steadily filling up these former plantation lands with new farmers and new ranchers. Again, in full disclosure, we want to diversify it more. As you know, as CTAHR knows, finding farmers that can be successful is not easy too. So how do we as a landowner partner on the land side with our lands? And I'll let Marissa go into the diversity of lands. I think that's a key point. We have, the lands look very different when you're in Hilo, to Kona, to Kaʻeo, to Kauai, to North Shore Oahu, to Windward Oahu. The lands are all different. The situation is all different. Some places we're fully subscribed. We have a wait list. And then there's some places where, our farmers and especially our native Hawaiians, we want land, and sometimes we are in areas that we don't have land. And the areas where we do have land available may not be where farmers want to go. So we're always trying to figure out that situation. But maybe I'm hoping that's sort of helpful, kind of big picture. And I'll let Marissa go into the numbers. But I do think it's important that, can we do more? Absolutely. Do we have it all figured out? No. Are we working really hard? Yes. And I also want to celebrate that, like Marissa mentioned, the many hundreds and hundreds, close to 1,000 farmers and ranchers who are working hard every day on our land. So sometimes for me, when people say you're not doing enough, for ag, I mean, we are the largest private lessor of land. We are the largest private provider of agricultural land and have the largest partnership of farmers and tenants in the state. So while there's always more work to be done, I want to honor all those farmers and ranchers who every day are toiling on Kamehameha School's lands, both steward the land and to produce food. So I just want to call that out. And maybe Marissa can talk a little bit about the portfolio from a number standpoint and where we have availability and opportunity and maybe where we have challenges. So maybe the audience can get a sense of what the portfolio looks like across the island.
Mahalo, Kaʻeo. So I think just to look back at your question that you had sent us earlier, that we have all the land, all the money, and why aren't we doing more, right? So to Kaʻeo's point, I think if I can dive a little deeper on the regional perspective, most folks know Kamehameha for what they are in the place that they live, right? And so when we're able to tell the story of what we have statewide, I think this fuller picture gets painted, right? If you go to Puna, we have math nuts, some pasture, and we have papaya in Puna. And we also have lava now. We lost about 900 acres to inundation in 2018. So that did impact some of our lands there. If you move into Hilo, we have lots of rain-fed crops. We have deep soils in Hilo. So we see farmers that are planting short-term vegetable crops, some flower crops. We move into Hamakua, those lands that we purchased from the plantation in 1994. I think I'll sidestep a little bit to say we're really proud of that decision that our leadership and trustees made to acquire kind of that last block of lands that were up for sale in the bankruptcy sale, because we really feel it helped to preserve that agricultural nature of Hamakua and really keep that open space feel, right? Other things we saw happen to lands bought up by smaller landowners was subdivision and, development of gentleman estates. And so we're really proud of the fact that, Hamakua, for the most part, we were able to kind of sustain that agricultural nature that's there. So when you get to Hamakua, kind of the more slopey lands with lots of rocks still. Somebody told me once in Hamakua, it's like, I'm farming rocks sometimes. I don't know where they come from. They keep coming up every time we till the soil. So, those lands, we put them in pasture, and we did develop a forestry program there. And we oftentimes, as Kaʻeo said, people want lands in areas we don't have lands. We often get asked, do you have anything in Waimea? Do you have anything in the Waikoloa area? We don't. And that's kind of a nature of the land legacy from Pauahi and where she inherited her lands from. And then you get to Kona, which Kaʻeo talked about our program there. We have orchards in Kona. Lots of coffee for sure. Probably, I don't think most folks know, somewhere between 70 to 80% of Kona coffee is grown on land that Kamehameha leases to farmers, right? So we're a big part of that kind of Kona coffee commodity. But we also have farmers doing mac nuts and cacao in Kona. We have ulu, mango, dragon fruit. We kind of start to get the real variety of other crops that folks have tried over the years when, macadamia has gone down. Some people have cut their 30-plus-year-old trees to try a new crop. We are proud that the largest the queen bee provider in the nation is on our land in Kona. So, lots of, I think, services to agriculture as a broader industry also happen on our lands when you think of pieces like that. Then we get to Ka'u, and we see more ranching. We see more mac nuts in Ka'u. And so every region's a little different. You get to Oahu, more urbanized, right? And so we have pockets of farms in places where we've been able to maintain agriculture. And North Shore, I think, is the most notable to people who live on Oahu. Maui, we have lands on the Lahaina side in Kuia. Water is a challenge for us there. So we have small farm going there, cacao farm. We also have education program for farmers there. And I think that's a big component to what else are we doing besides just leasing land. Partnerships we've developed, I think that's really going to be key to our success for like that next elevation of finding out what technical assistance do farmers need, what kind of supports to get started. And so we have a really good partnership with Go Farm. In fact, they're on our land in Hilo, right next to our ag office, developing new farmers every day through their cohorts. And we're on standby when those farmers are looking for land when they graduate. But, to be honest, many farmers who have gone through their program have access to land already. So we aren't really seeing that pipeline as we initially thought, at least in the Hilo program. But yeah, everywhere across the state's a little bit different in terms of the needs and then the lands that we have available. And then the quality of those lands, access to infrastructure, etc. In terms of the cost for land, I think we really pride ourselves on being accessible in terms of cost. I mean, the average cost of our land is around $250 an acre a year. So if a farmer is looking at a 10-acre farm, we're just over $200 a month in terms of their land costs. So what we're often finding is land is not necessarily the biggest obstacle for farmers to get started. So again, back to the partnerships, what are the challenges for farmers to get started? I mean, for 8 years, we've had the Mahi'ai Matchup Program, which we've done different versions of. We've done Mahi'ai Scale Up because we also saw, okay, there's a need, there's a lot of farmers, and they just need that next level up, right? That next cash infusion to get them to scale up their farm and get to the next level. So to Kaʻeo's point, I think we've really been putting our thoughts to paper since the 2009 ag plan. That was the first time we did an agricultural plan in our history. And how can we really be the agricultural lesser of choice? How can we help farmers and ranchers get a leg up in the marketplace? And marketing all those pieces, right, are part to success. And another way we help new farmers is we can allow them tenant improvements during their first 3 years of establishing their farm as a way to really try to alleviate the cost of land being their biggest hurdle. And so I could probably go on. There's so many other things I was thinking of as Kaʻeo was talking that are escaping me right now, but maybe I'll pause there and see if you want to pick up on it.
I'm making some notes here myself. There's so much, right, that you both talked about. What percent of you have a lot of acres in ag, but what percent of those are large ag? What percent of those are small? I think about the stats say there are about 7,000 ag producers in Hawaii, and of those, I think the majority are 4 acres or less. Is my memory of the stats. Large percentage of our ag producers in Hawaii are small ag. So I was just kind of curious what the allocation was of small ag producers on your lands versus larger ag producers. Let's use let's say 4 acres or less as kind of a delineation.
Well, our farms are set up a little different. Like if you look at Kona, where we have 600 farmers, really 2/3 of our farmer rancher tenants are in Kona. Those farms, the base zoning is 5-acre minimum. So those farms tend to range from 5 to 10 to 20 acres, depending on how the layout of that parcel subdivision was. So I consider those still small farms in our perspective, because they're mostly run by a single family or a generational household. So I would consider probably at least 2/3 of our farms are in that basket. Then if you go to the Punahilo Hamakua Coast, we have probably another 130 farmers there. Some of those are ranches, right? So the size and scale is more on the larger side, because we're in some places looking at 700-acre ranch leases. But if we take off about maybe 30 of those that are large ranches in Hamakua, maybe 700 of our 900 just on Hawaii Island, I would put in that small farmer basket.
Okay, that's interesting, because that seems like it's in sync with the needs that we've heard expressed by the ag producers we've interviewed. I guess it's worth asking as well. It's the price that you said was it $250 per acre per year?
In average, it depends on the crop and
and that may depend on the number of acres that are leased and term and things like that. Of course, it's normal, but if folks that we speak to comment that, all the people that have large acreage that are big ag are getting the best prices, and that the small guys are getting the inflated prices and aren't getting the long-term leases. That sounds like maybe that information is just perhaps even old, right? Kaʻeo
I
mentioned
would
that.
agree, Jim.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like it may just be gone from 20, 30 years ago even, right?
Yeah.
That was more true.
Yeah, well, let me take a stab. And again, Marissa's closer to the details nowadays than I am. I'll let her fill in and correct me if I get anything wrong here. But well, kind of building on her point, I mean, we do give, and we have in the past to try and get land into production. We have given reduced rent. By policy, we are allowed to be able to give some rent for like 3 to 5 years or so, and tenant improvement where it makes sense to get people up and running. And maybe that plays into some of what people have heard when we're trying to get people up and going. But in general, I mean, our rents are not based on size and acreage. They're based on the use. So we actually have some guidelines that how often do we reset it and check in on it every 5 years or
5
so?
years. And it's an internal set of guidelines.
Yeah. So we do we do work with consultants to take a look at ag lease pricing, and we kind of separate it by, again, the types of crop use. So for really high value, deep soil with water, with roads that are good for certain kinds of vegetable crops or higher value crops, or orchard crops will have a certain set of pricing that we think is competitive for Hawaii. And then for instance, pasture lands, we'll have a range based on carrying capacity of the land, how many animals can those lands. So, for those ranchers who are ranching some really tough lava, haulekoa lands and so on and so forth, that can't carry that much cattle per acre, their rents per acre for those pasture lands will be lower than, say, really lush prime pasture lands that can have a higher carrying capacity for cattle will be slightly higher. So for pasture, there'll be a range. For our orchard and vegetable and so forth, there'll be a range. For traditional crops, other kinds of uses, we also have a range. So that allows us to, one, have some level of rigor, but also give some flexibility to Marissa's team as they work with different partners and different lands in different places. So we try and have some level of standardization, so we can, be fair and consistent across the state, the 5 islands we manage, while also having some level of flexibility. But Marissa, maybe you can chime in if I missed anything.
I mean, just to give some reference to what our rents are, maybe compared to other smaller private landowners, maybe 10 years ago or so, when sweet potato was all the rage in Hilo and Hamakua, and the farmers couldn't find enough land to plant sweet potato for export. While we don't ask other landowners what their rents are, and we generally don't share specific details of leases, the farmers who would farm with us and farm with other landowners just say, "Oh, your rents are so much more reasonable. We're paying $400 to $800 an acre," but that was for fresh, never planted sweet potato land that they felt they could guarantee was not going to have bugs and pests and other disease. But it was a little shocking to hear, and I think it really goes to where some of our values are in terms of what really truly focusing on supporting ag and the farmers. And I think to that stewardship point also, right, then the lands are stewarded, we have somebody there taking care of them, and they're being productive, they're producing food. And so we kind of look at all those other outcomes that come along with the farm itself.
That's great. I think, I have a lot more questions, but let's
Yeah.
move to the next topic, which I think might
Okay.
be most interesting to our audience, or more interesting than my questions is perhaps if you had an example or two of some of the land management successes or challenges. One that comes to mind for me, because I'm on the Hamakua Coast, is perhaps the eucalyptus trees that were planted there. And what I hear, part of it's potentially all gossip from my neighbors, right? And I don't know how much is fact. Part of it is maybe perhaps not paying enough attention. But so you hear stories about how that land was
was supposed to be developed and how that failed, and then other things were tried and that failed. And we see the eucalyptus trees, like, a month or two ago, being trimmed to not take out all the power lines every time there's a big storm. And so I don't know if that's an example you want to use, or if that's an appropriate one, but whatever examples you might want to use of some of the land management successes or challenges that you've had to deal with as an example.
Well, maybe there's a piece of that I could take that is relative to really any crop. And I think challenge is often the market, right? So as we've seen, the original market intended when the original planting was done, well, neither Kaʻeo or here, but that has changed over time, right? So the world market, the global market, and the impact on our crops. So oftentimes we see our tenants growing what can sell. So for example, I know at one point, cilantro got hit on Oahu with, I don't know if there was a bad storm, or so then farmers here picked up on that and, okay, I'm going to grow cilantro, and then it was too rainy in Hilo for it, right? So I think one of the bigger challenges is the farmers having kind of a stable market where they know I can produce this much, I'm going to garner this much revenue, and I can keep going. So I think there's so many challenges that impact our farmers, and I kind of just tried to put some notes down this morning. So we've talked about infrastructure, right? So in the places where we've had plantations, we do have old road systems, but those need to be maintained. Same with water systems. Labor has been a big challenge for a lot of our farmers, especially the ones that depend on pickers for mac nuts and coffee, and have these kind of 5 to 10 acre farms where it's a little hard for the family to do it all. And we've seen labor be probably a constant issue in the 15 years that I've been at Kamehameha, all tied to also global economy too, right? And things that are happening out there. And then I think with CTAHR, you guys know very well just the monitoring of disease and pests that we're dealing with, I would say, on a constant, right? New reports coming out from CTAHR. I'm always watching what's coming out on the monthly report from Andrea. I think other things that I think small farmers deal with, that we deal with on a larger basis, real property tax and the challenges of keeping that agricultural land in ag, right? And we've tried to establish a relationship with the County of Hawaii where most of our lands are, just kind of keeping that dialogue ongoing with annual valuations, and as others develop their ag land around us, right? And I think another challenge too is just keeping up what we have, that repair and maintenance and ongoing commitment to agriculture that in turn then supports the farmers who are on our lands. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, a little bit, and maybe to again build on, I'll get to Hamakua and the eucalyptus trees a little bit there, but again to tie back to what we talked about earlier, the transition from plantations. Again, the challenge and the opportunity. So it's hard work transitioning former plantation lands to a new future, but it's also exciting and rewarding work on that journey. So on the North Shore of Oahu, it's a certain journey around infrastructure and cost, and how do we make this pencil out? I do think that's important. I mean, I will be real, frank that yes, we do want our agricultural portfolio. We're not government. We are data point trust, and we are trying to manage our lands to create both financial and non-financial outcomes, both to benefit the schools, but also our community. So that's what we're always trying to do. And so for our ag lands, we really are looking towards a future where how do we do our part to make agriculture a self-sustaining industry again in Hawaii? It's not going to look the way it did before, nor should it, of what the plantations look like. I don't think anyone has that answer, but we are committed to being a part of that journey. So from when the plantations came back, we're in the red. I mean, our agricultural portfolio was in the red for many, many years. We are proud that in, I don't know what, Marissa, maybe 5-6 years ago, it finally peaked into the black. It's a small little sliver of our endowment from a financial perspective, but we're proud to be able to move both on the pounds and the 70 different crops that are grown on our lands, the diversity of crops, as well as being able to, how do we have a viable, self-sustaining agricultural portfolio of a diverse set of tenants and opportunities. And again, it looks different in different places. Hamakua is an interesting one. As Marissa mentioned, that actually is not part of Hawaii's inheritance. So the Hamakua lands, there are two skinny ahupa and Hamakua that she did inherit, but otherwise, the majority of that is fairly new as part of the Kamehameha Schools family purchased in the 90s, the mid 90s. 30,000 acres, purchased at auction. So when that decision was made in the 90s, as you can imagine, and as plantations all over were shutting down, huge impacts on communities like in Hamakua and Pauilo, Honoka'a, and so on and so forth. So working with community and so forth, how do we put that much acreage into active use immediately so that all the kinds of issues that happen when land just stays vacant aren't realized. Of course, that's happening at a time when we didn't. I mean, if we're being honest about it, we did not have a viable and a really robust agricultural industry outside of plantations. And I would say we're still working on that as a state. So there was not like there was a bunch of, so there's not a cop out, but there was not like a bunch of ag to just jump onto 30,000 acres. So I'll keep it real simple. The general strategy was, okay, we bought these lands, rather suddenly in the mid 90s. The lands makai of the ditch were put into pasture with the thought of, ranchers were ready to take it on and put fencing and get those lands, secured and producing at least beef for Hawaii. And the thought was, again, makai of the ditch, because, one day we could, potentially extract some of those lands from ranching for other uses as the agricultural industry further developed. That because there's the ditch there was, we'll have water. So everything makai of the ditch was pasture with an eye for diversification in the future as the ag industry developed. Everything mauka of the ditch where there was no water, the thought was forestry. And as Marissa said, at that time there was strong economics around those trees, and it hasn't panned out the way we thought it would, or that our master tenant thought it would be. And those trees definitely, should have been harvested years ago per the original plan, but gone through a couple lessees at this time who have had to, walk away, and who took a little bit of a licking with trying to make that happen. And we are actively looking to find some ways to make those trees productive from some kind of fuel or fiber perspective. While at the same time, Marissa and the team is trying to already diversify the use of those lands with silvopastoral use under the trees. Lands that were harvested are being repositioned for other kinds of uses, ranching, dairy. We have a new dairy lessee to try and bring milk back to our islands. And then with new community tenants like Hui Mau in Pauilo doing cultural ag education community work. And we're excited about seeing little kipukas as we're on a journey to diversify. So Hamakua is a good example around, there's definitely been challenges on this journey, and we're trying to adapt and flex as we move forward. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I imagine it would have been much simpler for you folks if it had been a success, right? And you could just be the landlord or the leaser, the lessor of lands, and the plan of the person that's leasing it was successful. That's what everyone wants, I think. And I imagine it's just when it becomes complex and things do not work out, which happens a lot in agriculture, then you actually end up doing a lot more work as a result, and a lot more work than I expect you'd want to have to as the lessor. So yes,
I would say, just to add, is I think it's an important point, is as we look at our agricultural lands, we're always trying to look at industries more and more so. So I know Jim will have another session on food systems, and we'll talk more about this at that podcast. I'll try and refrain from getting into it today, but especially as an educational institution, jobs, careers, and industries, and a long-term institution, like how do we invest and position our lands to support vibrant communities, which inherently must include local jobs, careers, and industries. So the forestry, though we weren't there at the original planting, when the second round of lessees came, we were in conversations around it really wasn't just about eucalyptus, for energy and so forth. It was how do we create a forestry industry, just as we're trying to create an agricultural industry for our food system industry. How do we create a fiber, hardwood, and a diverse, robust forest industry with jobs and different careers tied toward from planting and maintenance to harvesting to, the thought was eventually get to a place where high value hardwoods, obviously we do have coil forests and so forth, to that end, all the way to, veneers and laminates and plywoods, and how do we create an industry creating fiber and wood products grown in Hawaii, for Hawaii, and creating an economics. But creating that forestry industry it has proven a lot harder than folks thought. But there's a part of Kamehameha Schools that still believes, aside from food production, that side of agriculture, that forestry and timber done correctly, if we truly want Hawaii to be able to support itself with, again, fiber and wood, has its place. But I think we just haven't cracked that nut yet of how to do that. And whether eucalyptus is the right tree or not, that's obviously debatable. Lessons learned, but that's kind of part of our thought process also.
And one key thing that I've heard a few times as we've been talking, or what I think is key, because we hear a lot of folks in ag production and are supporting ag production in the islands think is key to success, is growing more and having more food that's grown that stays on the islands and is not sent off islands. It's not exported. Just like, I hear you saying creating jobs is part of one of the criteria that's looked at, but is that one of the criteria that you're assessing when someone applies for lands? Is the food that's produced or the products produced going to be used locally, or is that on your radar, or is that not one of the factors that's part of the variables you assess?
I think it's something we definitely, obviously we talk about what their plan is, what's your crop plan, production plan, how do you plan to put this land into use? But I think it comes back to that market question. And the other team leader you'll meet later in the week, focusing on the sustainable food systems in Hawaii, a big part of that conversation is changing the palette, right? Creating that ono that people have for the crops that we can grow here. So I think it's a really tough situation for a farmer do they want to grow a crop that we know is good for Hawaii, but they might not be able to sell it, or the price they have to sell it at is too high. So I think there's a big piece here with the consumer. Because I think Richard Haw used to always say, right, if the farmer's is going to make money, the farmer's going to farm, right? So I think we have to honor that business side for our farmers, right? We can't expect people to grow our food and then not be willing to pay them what they deserve for it. So I don't know that we've had as many conversations on that end, Kaʻeo, but it's definitely part of the larger puzzle for changing how food stays in Hawaii, right? And what people want to import from other places. So a lot of that, I think even our local chefs that started out that Hawaii cuisine really have helped with producing that ono for locally grown food, but at a price that maybe is not accessible to all consumers. So I think that's a big part of it, Jim, in what people want to grow and can make a living at.
Yeah. I'll add to that, because I think the short answer, to your question is, like, if we're trying to give preference or privilege to food crops, more recently, yes. I think, as the plantations came back, there's a time, especially when there was a dearth of new farmers and opportunities, just, be real honest, if there's a farmer or rancher who had the will and the experience and were willing to work the land, we were interested, and we were interested in talking to them, and especially in places where we've been challenged with finding farmers. I think as we moved along, under our current strategic plan, we absolutely have a food system focus. We have a goal at the enterprise level, at the highest level of our report card to trustees is actually a food systems goal of the amount of food produced. And we have measures and targets to track the amount of food produced on our land. as well as the food that we are procuring and also processing and distributing our lands. But again, we'll save that for the food systems conversation. So we have some very intentional institutional goals around food. So as vacant lands come available, Marissa and the team are specifically trying to focus on local food type production rather than other non-food type items and so forth. So we're getting a little bit more picky, if you will, around like Marissa said, a new tenant has to submit a farm plan. So we are looking for experience, that they have some sense of what they want to do and some sense of a plan. And then local food type production and diversification, right? We are looking to try and diversify our portfolio, like any farmer knows, or any portfolio owner of assets knows, having a diverse portfolio is inherently more robust, especially for a long-term institution like us. So what that means is in certain areas where we have mostly pasture or mostly coffee or so on and so forth, no slight to our ranchers or our coffee farmers, but if there's a farmer comes in with a really innovative plan to get a new crop going or to fill a gap in the local market for production, I think we'll take a hard look at that. Whereas we could, the easy route might be to go with a certain type of use that is kind of well proven and so forth. But in some places, we are intentionally trying to diversify. And I would say for indigenous crops like kalo, ulu, and so on and so forth, as a Native Hawaiian institution, we are also trying to increase the percentage of our lands used for our indigenous Native Hawaiian crops also. And that is incremental, but we are slowly increasing that acreage over time in different parts of the islands.
If I could just add one more thing, Jim, because you asked about successes. And so I think spinning off of what Kaʻeo just talked about, it reminded me of the work we've been doing with the Ulu Co-op. So at our Hilo office location, we built a post-harvest building that at the time we were designing it, we had built it with the mind to keep our Hilo farmers who were starting to face food safety issues, that we would have a food safety certified facility where they could come do post-harvest, wash and pack. Some of those farmers moved on in the time that it took us to design, permit, and build that structure. But fortunately, we were able to develop a partnership with the Ulu Co-op, who is now the main lessee of that facility, and they're using it as their East Hawaii aggregation site. And what we've also seen is a couple new Ulu orchard leases that we've embarked on in the North Hilo area, who are members of the Ulu Co-op. So I think that's a good example of success where KS could provide kind of the foundational infrastructure for something that maybe a farmer couldn't build on their own, but then can be utilized by multiple farmers to kind of really elevate that market for that local crop. So we're pretty proud of that project.
Indeed, I know Ulu Co-op is one of the key pieces of the ag puzzle these days, it seems, and that Ulu, as Kaʻeo was mentioning, or as you were mentioning, Marissa, I mean, if you want to foster more growing of the canoe crops and use of that throughout the islands, I think some folks don't know Ulu and how to prepare it. And they partnered with Sam Choi on a cookbook that has just come out. So I think they're really ahead of the game and key to connecting a bunch of the pieces that are necessary to make it.
And that's that market piece and creating that ono, and people know how to cook it, and then they desire it and they want to buy it, right? So it's kind of that full circle picture.
Exactly.
I think in general on Ulu Co-op, but again generalizing from the Ulu Co-op to food hubs, and again we'll probably talk more about it, Jim, in the food systems podcast. But Ulu Co-op and other food hubs are critical for the point you raised earlier. So many of our farms in Hawaii are small farms, and that inherently creates a certain challenge, opportunity again, for Hawaii's food system, again, beyond agriculture, the whole system, to make that system work from aggregation, distribution, and so forth. But I've heard many, ag experts, economists say that ag will never work in Hawaii unless you have really mid to large scale farms. You need scale or ag just simply will not work. But then for me, I pondered that a lot, but at the end of the day, I'm like, well, the reality is we have hundreds and hundreds of small farms. So, we can theorize that ag won't work in Hawaii unless we have really large farms at scale. But the reality is we have many small farms. So we can either admit defeat, or we can say, no, there's a way to do it. There's a way to create a food system infrastructure that can be successful with small farms. I'm not saying we've cracked the nut yet as a state, but I think the Ulu Co-op and all the food hubs have been a critical. I mean, I know there's a lot still to be worked out, and that there's still a small percentage of the whole value chain or supply chain of food that gets onto our tables and in our refrigerators. But it's critical for us to be supporting them because, again, the whole food hub concept is be able to have an aggregator connector to many small farms, which could be a critical addition to the food system in Hawaii to help make a large network of small farms successful. But I do think if we cannot crack that nut, we're going to be continue to be reliant on importation of food from the current paradigm of the way the system is set up. So I would bring that piece in because for KS and from the state, the fact that we have so many small farms, it is what it is. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So I think while there's nothing wrong with mid to large scale farms and they absolutely have their place, I think we got to figure out a way to create that infrastructure.
Absolutely. And yeah, it does seem to be increasing in numbers for sure and percentage of the total number of farmers. So, but I mean, we've taken up a lot of your time here. So just as kind of a last question that I think might be most valuable to some of the folks that would be listening and that are ag producers or want to be in ag production is if I'm a small farmer, 10 acres or less is what I feel I can manage on my own as a start. And I wanted to try to get access to available land that Kamehameha Schools has. What would be the process I would go through?
Sure, I'll take that question, Jim. So we have an INA website. We can provide you the link later, Jim. It's www.ksbe.edu/INA. And I think one of the new features we have is folks can actually go on to our interactive map and navigate, number one, where our lands even are located. The contact us button on there will take the email writer to me. That email gets forwarded to me. So I personally do field all the inquiries for land. And then from there, I connect the requester with the appropriate asset manager, depending on the region that they're interested in. We have a fairly simple tenant application that we ask folks to fill out and give us an idea of what they're looking for. And that kind of starts the conversation with the asset manager. So that's the general process. I know one of your earlier questions was on finding tenants. So we do keep our tenants. So the vacancies tend to be low because we love to continue to work with our farmers and ranchers when that relationship is going well. So I know there's some frustration out there in terms of like, is there any land available? And to Kaʻeo's point, it depends where you live. So I'm happy to talk with folks if they connect with us through our website, and we can take that conversation from there.
Okay, start with the map, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well as in the YouTube notes for here. I think this has been very helpful for the YouTube audience and for the folks that watch it on video. I wondered if you did want to take a minute to explain the backgrounds that you chose for the videos, because I thought those might be interesting to our viewers.
Our virtual backgrounds?
Your virtual background. So Marissa, would you mind sharing?
Sure. So on the side of my virtual background, it says Mahalo Pauahi. So I was explaining to Jim when we got on that we're getting into the month leading up to Pauahi's birthday. We celebrate Founders Day on December 19th, her birthday, or around it if it falls on a weekend. And so I decided to just change my background today as we're leading up to that month, remembering Pauahi. And I think just starting out with the foundation of our conversation today, who we are is because of Pauahi. So that's my background today. Thank you.
And Kaʻeo?
Yeah, so I'm sitting in our I say our Keoho office, but it's actually in the Ahupua'a of Kahaluu. So I chose so this image is of the heiau in the Makai region of Kahaluu, Ahupua'a here in Kona. Important both for Kamehameha schools is probably not probably it is our highest concentration of sacred sites and heiau burial, and it was a center of thinking, of knowledge, of politics, of learning for our ali'i. And we've recently, as we've removed the former Keho Beach Hotel and really dedicating it for our kids, our family, and our community, and Ike Kupuna in ancestral knowledge as a kind of a piko or a center of knowledge and education for our little ones. Well, all of our learners, from our little ones to our kupuna learners, all of us are lifelong learners. And I'm actually my ohana, my grandma is from Kahaluu, born on in the middle of Kamehameha School's land. So it's also important to me personally, this Ahupua'a. So just where I'm sitting today.
Nice, thank you. I think this has been really valuable. For me, I read the book Broken Trust, right? It was one of the books I was told to read to really help understand some of what's happened in the culture and Kamehameha School's involvement. And it's I think as a result, it's been a black eye, frankly, on Kamehameha that I feel like may cause people to jump to conclusions, perhaps negative conclusions about Kamehameha. So I think I think this has shed a lot of light on all the work you are doing. Again, this is my perspective, but it seems like it's almost like parenting is what you're having to do, and because it's not just a landlord-tenant relationship, it's really a nurturing relationship where you're trying to ensure the success of the folks that are on the land, and in some cases, to use the parenting analogy, I mean, in some cases the kids struggle and they fail and they are in trouble, and it sounds like you folks are regularly jumping in to try to help ensure their success. So I really appreciate the deeper conversation, richer conversation around it all.
We'd like to thank Kaʻeo and Marissa for their perspectives on the history and role of KS as land manager in Hawaii. We hope this look at the details and challenges they face may help repair some broken trust we have heard many Hawaii residents voice in reference to KS actions of the past, actions that have now evolved to philosophies based on a larger view of the entire Hawaii food system and driven by the KS strategic plan.
I don't know if the parent analogy would be appreciated by some of our tenants, but just the yes, I mean the history of Kamehameha schools, the ups and downs, as I've read the history over time, there's again lots of successes and a lot of challenges and periods that have been sore spot for Kamehameha schools and our community. A community of farmers and lands where we're restoring people and place simultaneously, that through the restoration of these lands, we're restoring people and community. Again, we don't have it all figured out, but that's our vision. That's the destination in our mind. And as you know, relationships and trust is absolutely critical. And that takes time. There's some places that I've been in many conversations, really conversations with angry conversations, tears, but also a lot of laughter and recovery and joy. So community by community, place by place. I just want to say that out loud for us with our tenants / partners. I really want to think of them as partners, helping us steward these lands to create food, fiber, other kinds of non-food products, beef, so on and so forth. And how do we engage in a way that we're able to create that kind of trust and relationships? But just mahalo for allowing us the chance to share the journey we're on, as we're trying to create that community of partners and relationships in this community. Because all of us on this team, we all live in these communities, whether it's Marissa and Hilo or me and Kona. I mean, my family was literally born and raised on a Kamehameha School's lease for 4 generations. So it's important both personally and professionally to us. But we encourage dialogues like this are important. We have nothing to hide. We know we're not perfect, but we do want to move forward in a positive direction. So look forward to more conversations.
No, thank you. And I guess I also feel compelled to comment again from my perspective. I see Kamehameha Schools as deeply rooted in the past and with a great respect for the history of place and people. However, it's clear that you are constantly evolving, and especially more recently, trying new paradigms and new models to see what works. And so you're not stuck in the past, but instead you're just kind of constantly evolving and paying attention to what makes sense for the present and the future.
And Jim, if your listeners and viewers go on to our INA website, I know we only talked about agriculture today, but they'll be able to see a variety of things we're doing on our lands in addition to agriculture, right? So we have our energy program. We're doing community plans that we have websites for. So there is a lot to Kamehameha. This is one facet of it.
And we will talk again soon about some more of the facets. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much. Mahalo nui.
Aloha.
The intention of this podcast series is to create a safe space for respectful and inclusive dialogue with people from across a broad and diverse spectrum involved in growing and making accessible the food we share together. A diversity of voices, perspectives, and experiences can serve to deepen mutual understanding, to spark creative problem solving, and provide insight into the complexities of our agricultural system. If you, our listeners, have experiences with Hawaii agricultural ecosystems from small, older farms to large, even including multinational agricultural industrial companies, or anywhere in between, and you would like to share your story, please contact us. We welcome your voices and perspectives.